After saving a wild foal, a man is surrounded by a herd of Mustang horses. What they do next is unbelievable. It began with a scream. Not the scream of a human, but a high-pitched, frantic cry that sliced through the sound of the wind like a blade. It was the unmistakable sound of terror, raw, young, and helpless, and it was coming from somewhere below the ridge. Tom Barrett had heard many things during his years out on the range. Coyotes calling to the moon, elk bugling in the early hours, even the haunting silence before a lightning strike. But nothing quite like this. It was the kind of sound that forced your body to react before your brain could even process what was happening. He sprinted toward the edge of the bluff, boots slipping on the rain-slick stones, and when he looked down into the ravine below, his heart nearly stopped. A foal, no more than a few weeks old, alone, trapped. The gulch had turned to a rushing stream from the afternoon storm, a sudden deluge that caught even the most seasoned animals off guard. The walls of the gulch were steep, slick with mud and tangled roots, and the current below surged with runoff from the distant mountains. And there, in the middle of it all, was the tiny creature. Chest deep in water, struggling to keep its footing, its spindly legs slipping on submerged stones. Each time it fell, it cried out again, shriller, more desperate. Its head jerked around, searching, expecting a mother that wasn't there. The herd was gone, driven off by the storm or scattered in the chaos. But one thing was certain: if someone didn't act now, this foal wouldn't survive another 5 minutes. Tom hesitated, not because he doubted what he needed to do, but because he understood what it would mean. He had studied wild horses for years, spent months tracking them across open grasslands, through thickets and river valleys, respecting the sacred rule of non-interference. Observe, record, never intervene. But this wasn't about science anymore. This was about life, about the instinct that runs deeper than any training, the refusal to let something so young, so utterly innocent, die alone. He dropped his pack and slid down the embankment, grabbing onto anything he could: thorny shrubs, exposed roots, jagged rocks, anything to slow his descent without tumbling headfirst into the raging water. Mud soaked through his clothes. Rain still fell in icy sheets, stinging his face, blurring his vision. But he kept his eyes locked on the foal, who had now collapsed completely, half submerged and shivering. Its cries had weakened. The fight was almost gone from its tiny frame. Tom reached the bottom of the gulch, the icy water surging around his knees, and staggered toward the foal, each step a battle against the current. He was nearly there when the foal slipped again, its head going under for a terrifying second. That was all it took. Tom surged forward, arms out, and caught the young horse just as it began to float away. He hoisted it up against his chest, its body soaked, shaking, almost weightless with exhaustion. Mud clung to its coat, its eyes were wide and wild, but it was alive. The foal's heart was racing so fast it felt like a drumbeat against Tom's ribs. It made no effort to struggle, no attempt to escape. Instinctively, it leaned into the warmth, its front legs dangling over Tom's shoulders as he adjusted his grip. For a moment they just stood there, man and foal, in the middle of the storm-swollen ravine. One breathing hard, the other barely breathing at all. Tom knew the climb back up would be harder. The weight of the animal, the slipperiness of the slope, the fatigue already in his arms, every second counted. And yet he also knew something else. He wasn't alone. He hadn't noticed it at first, not through the noise of the rain and the roar of rushing water. But now, with the foal pressed against him and the worst of the panic past, he felt something shift in the air. A new sound, barely audible above the wind. A distant, rhythmic pounding. It was coming from the plains above the gulch, and it was getting closer. The herd was returning. Tom's boots sank deep into the sodden earth with each step as he began the slow, punishing climb out of the ravine. The foal clung limply to his shoulders, its breath hot and fast against the back of his neck. Its legs dangled on either side of him, trembling with the aftershock of what it had endured. The weight wasn't much, maybe 50 pounds at most, but with the mud pulling at his every move, and the water still pushing against his knees, it may as well have been 100. Every muscle in his legs screamed for rest, but Tom pressed on, his hands clawing for traction on roots and rocks slick with rain. There was no other option. He couldn't stop. The foal's life depended on it, and, perhaps without fully realizing it yet, so did something much bigger. His heart pounded in his chest, not just from exertion, but from the sheer adrenaline flooding his system. The moment he had scooped the foal from the water, something irreversible had happened. A line had been crossed, a sacred boundary between human and wild. Conservationists spent their lives drawing that line, learning to respect it, never breach it. Nature had its own laws. Interference, even with good intentions, often led to chaos. But that line had dissolved the instant he heard that foal scream. It wasn't calculation that pushed him forward. It was something more ancient, more primal, compassion unburdened by consequence. He knew the risks. He'd studied wild horse behavior. Herds could be unpredictable, fiercely protective, especially when it came to their young. A human with one of their foals in his arms could be seen not as a rescuer, but as a threat. And now the sound of hoofbeats thundered louder from the plains above, echoing off the canyon walls in a deep, rolling rhythm that seemed to vibrate in his bones. Reaching the halfway point, Tom paused, chest heaving, one knee digging into the slope for balance. The foal shifted slightly on his back, letting out a weak, wheezing snort. He turned his head just enough to see its eye, wide, dark, and frightened, but still conscious, still present. That was enough to keep him moving. He adjusted his grip, wiped mud from his forehead with the back of his hand, and pushed upward once more. Every inch of elevation brought with it another pang of doubt. What would the herd do when they saw him? Would they charge? Would they try to reclaim the foal by force? There were stories, unconfirmed but whispered often enough, of stallions reacting violently to perceived threats, even from humans. But Tom wasn't carrying a threat. He was carrying hope, and in that moment he could only pray the horses would understand the difference. The sky had begun to change. The thick black clouds were breaking apart, letting bands of evening light streak through, turning the soaked prairie into a shimmering landscape of gold and green. The wind, still strong, had shifted from violent to cleansing. It carried the scent of rain, wet soil, and wild grasses, and something else, something heavier, the unmistakable musk of horses. It was everywhere now, surrounding him. He was close to the top. The final stretch was the steepest. One misstep here, and he and the foal would slide all the way back down. Tom planted his hands and knees into the mud and dragged himself upward, inch by inch, refusing to stop even as his arms quivered and his legs buckled. With a final surge, he broke over the lip of the ravine and collapsed onto the flat ground above, gasping for air. The foal let out a soft, bleating cry, and Tom turned onto his side to cradle it gently. That's when he saw them. Dozens of shapes, motionless yet alert, lined the hilltop less than 50 yards away, eyes shining, manes dripping with rain, flanks rising and falling with deep, deliberate breaths. A full herd of wild horses stood in absolute silence, every one of them facing him. It was not a charge, not yet. It was something else, a judgment. A moment balanced so precariously that the smallest wrong move could send it spiraling. Tom didn't dare rise. He stayed on one knee, shielding the foal with his body, his breathing slowing as his eyes met the gaze of the stallion at the center. He was massive, larger than any Tom had seen in the field, with a dark chestnut coat and a thick mane that clung to his neck like a warrior's cape. His nostrils flared, his ears pinned forward. He didn't blink. Tom couldn't tell what he was seeing in those eyes. Rage, confusion, recognition. Time stretched. The foal stirred again, letting out a whimper, and for the first time, the stallion moved. Just one step forward, deliberate, powerful, measured, then another. The herd parted slightly as he advanced, still silent, still watching. Tom's pulse thundered in his ears. He didn't move, didn't even breathe. He had carried this foal out of the mouth of a river. Now he had to carry it through the judgment of its own kind, and he had no idea what they would decide. The weight of the foal settled deeper into Tom's shoulders as he slowly rose from his knees, his breath shallow, his limbs stiff with exhaustion and cold. Every fiber of his body ached from the climb, from the tension, from the gravity of the moment still unfolding before him. The foal, weak but conscious, clung instinctively to him, its chest pressed against the back of his neck, small hooves hooked against his collarbones. Its damp coat brushed against his cheek with each trembling breath. It made no sound now, no cries, no whinnies, only the soft rhythm of its breathing, fragile and uncertain. And Tom stood motionless, staring across the narrow stretch of prairie at the horses that had come to collect what he had carried out of the abyss. The herd had not moved since the stallion stepped forward. They stood like statues cut from wind and thunder, eyes fixed on him. Some shifted their weight slightly, flicking their tails in slow, sweeping arcs. Others had their ears pricked forward, locked on the foal. No one approached. No one retreated. It was as if they too were holding their breath. The stillness wasn't quiet. Not really. There was the distant roll of thunder still lingering on the horizon, the wet rustle of tall grass in the wind, and beneath it all, the pulse of something ancient, a tension that pulsed through the earth itself. The land was listening. Tom took one cautious step forward, then another. His boots squelched in the mud with each footfall, the ground soft but beginning to solidify as the rain moved on, and the sky opened wider above him. The weight on his shoulders shifted, and he adjusted the foal gently, murmuring something, not words, just a sound, low and steady, more for himself than for the animal. The wind picked up for a moment, carrying his scent toward the herd. Several horses flinched. One mare took a nervous step back. The stallion held firm. He was close enough now to see the tension in the big horse's chest, the faint quiver in the muscles of his legs. A single, explosive movement from Tom could trigger a stampede. But he didn't move quickly. He walked with a kind of reverence, not toward the horses, but toward what they represented in that moment. Something far beyond instinct or territory, something deeper. The line between threat and trust was razor thin, and Tom was walking it with a half-dead foal on his back and no certainty of what would come next. The foal stirred again, this time shifting its head weakly and letting out a faint, warbling whimper. That sound changed everything. A mare near the front of the herd suddenly cried out, not a scream of warning, but a sharp, emotional whinny that cut across the distance and made Tom stop in his tracks. The foal's ears flicked toward the sound, its head lifted just slightly, and then the mare broke from the herd. Not charging, not panicking, just moving forward, urgent, determined, calling again as she came. Her hooves struck the earth with short, quick strides, her eyes locked, not on Tom, but on the bundle of life draped across him. Tom froze, letting her come. The mare reached him in less than 10 seconds, though it felt like time had bent around them. She was soaked from the storm, her coat matted and glistening, her sides heaving. She approached with her head low, stretched forward, nostrils flaring. She moved straight to the foal, her foal, and let out a soft, guttural nicker so close that Tom could feel the warmth of her breath on his skin. The foal responded instantly. A small, croaking bleat escaped its throat, its legs twitching on his shoulders. The mare nuzzled its face, gently, carefully, and for the first time since he'd pulled the foal from the water, Tom felt its weight shift with purpose. The little body squirmed, struggling to stand, to return to the familiar smell and touch of the one it knew. Tom slowly knelt, letting the foal slide off his back and into the soft grass. It stood on shaky legs, barely able to support its own weight, and nearly collapsed again. But the mare stepped in, steadying it with her body, pressing her nose to its side as it leaned against her for support. She sniffed every inch of it, inspecting, comforting, anchoring it with touch and sound. And all around them, the herd began to move. The stallion stepped forward again, his ears no longer pinned but swiveling, alert. The others followed, a few at a time at first, then more, until the entire group had formed a wide, shifting arc around Tom and the reunited pair. There was no panic, no frenzy, only curiosity, and something more. Horses communicate through movement, through posture, through breath. And now their bodies told a story he never expected to read. They weren't here to confront him. They were here to understand, and in their stillness he understood something too. He was no longer carrying the foal, but something far heavier had settled into his chest, a strange mix of awe, fear, humility, and wonder. He had crossed a line, and somehow they hadn't rejected him for it. They had accepted it, accepted him, not entirely, not yet, but enough. The black stallion reached them at last, towering over the foal, over the mare, over Tom. He lowered his massive head slowly and sniffed the foal's back, then turned his face toward the man who had returned it. His nostrils flared once, twice. Then he exhaled, not sharply, not with threat, but with something that almost sounded like relief. He looked directly at Tom, eyes deep and wide, unreadable in every way that mattered. And then he did the most unexpected thing. He stepped aside, not back, not away, but to the side, just enough to make space, as if giving room, as if saying, "You may stay, for now." The wind swept across the open plain like a whisper from the past, curling around the figures now gathered in a delicate balance. Man, mare, foal, and a herd of untamed horses that had not yet made up their minds. Tom remained kneeling beside the recovering foal, unsure if he had just been welcomed or merely tolerated. He dared not move. The black stallion had made space, but it wasn't permission, it was possibility. That difference, razor thin, carried the weight of everything that could happen next. The stallion towered above him, a living force of raw muscle and ancient instinct, his thick mane stirring in the wind like a battle flag. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. He simply stood as guardian, watching every breath Tom took, every flicker of tension in his muscles. Behind the stallion, the rest of the herd fanned out in a wide arc that formed a living wall, more a barrier of intention than bodies. Their formation wasn't aggressive, no pinned ears, no stamping hooves, but there was an unmistakable alertness, a collective intelligence humming through the group. Every movement seemed coordinated by something deeper than sight or sound, something rooted in the way prey animals survive, by becoming one body with many eyes. It was like watching a single, enormous organism shift its weight, watching without blinking. Tom's eyes moved from the stallion to the others. There were mares with damp coats, some older, battle-tested, scarred from years of fending off predators and storms alike. Younger fillies stood close to their mothers, their wide eyes peering at him with caution. A few colts, maybe a year old, clustered at the back, stamping the mud in restless bursts of energy. The entire herd was perfectly still and yet always in motion, tails flicking, muscles flexing, nostrils flaring, like a storm held at bay by its own will. The foal shifted beside him, its legs folded under it awkwardly, but it managed to sit upright, propped against its mother's flank. The mare had not moved more than a few inches since the reunion. Her body pressed against her foal like a fortress, her head now turned slightly toward Tom, ears not pinned, not forward, neutral, watchful. She didn't fear him, but trust? That would take more than one act of bravery. It would take silence, stillness, and something even harder to offer in the presence of wildness, humility. And Tom understood that. He had spent years trying to capture the beauty of wild horses without disrupting their lives, studying them from a distance, admiring their grace from behind lenses and notebooks. But distance was gone now. It had vanished the moment he stepped into the river. Now he was no longer an observer. He was a participant, not by invitation, by consequence. The stallion took another step, not toward Tom, but beside him, flanking the foal and the mare. His massive hooves sank slightly into the mud as he stopped just a breath away. It was a gesture loaded with meaning. He was close enough to strike if needed, close enough to shield his herd, but he chose not to. Instead, he stood like a sentry, the sentinel of this delicate moment, his presence both a warning and a message. You are in our space. You are near what we protect. We see you. Choose your next moment wisely. Tom didn't speak. He didn't move. But his thoughts raced. Every part of him wanted to back away, to give them space, to show respect by leaving. And yet, leaving now could break the fragile calm. It could startle the foal. It could trigger a reaction from the mares. One wrong movement could shift the mood from watchful to defensive. So, he breathed slow, eyes down but aware, letting his posture speak what words could not. I am not a threat. I am not here to take. I am here because I had no choice. A young mare stepped forward from the herd, pale grey, her mane long and tangled from the storm. She approached at an angle, head lowered, neck stretched, one hoof placed deliberately after another. Her eyes were locked on Tom, but there was something softer in her movements. She reached the mare and foal first, nuzzled them both, and then, slowly, she turned her gaze to the man. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then she took a single step closer to him. Just one. It was enough to make Tom's breath catch in his throat. Then another horse came forward. Then two more. The formation around him shifted subtly. The living wall was becoming a circle, but not a trap. A gathering, as if something had been decided not through language but through energy, through presence, through proof. The foal let out a soft whicker, lifting its head and wobbling slightly. Tom instinctively reached out a hand, not to touch but to steady, and then froze again. But this time there was no lurch of alarm in the herd, no defensive shift, only stillness. It was in that moment Tom felt something change, not in them, but in himself. He realized he wasn't afraid anymore, not of the horses, not of what they might do, but of what it meant to have been let in, even for a heartbeat. Even at the edge of a circle, no human was meant to stand inside. The stallion snorted softly, his head dipping slightly, as if acknowledging a decision only the wild could make. Tom stood there, drenched in mud and rain, heart still beating in his throat, and understood the unspoken truth of the moment. The herd had surrounded him, not to punish, not to drive him away, but to measure him, and for reasons he might never fully grasp, they had chosen not to reject him. For now, he was allowed to stand among them, not as one of them, but not as an outsider either. Something in between, something sacred. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Tom stood at the very edge of something ancient, surrounded by the soft shuffling of hooves, the rhythmic flick of damp tails, and the low resonant breath of wild creatures who lived without fences, without masters, without fear of anything but the natural world itself. The herd hadn't backed away. They hadn't broken formation. But something in their stance had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Their ears weren't pinned, their eyes weren't wide with alarm. They were assessing, yes, still cautious, but no longer braced for threat. It was a standoff not born of conflict, but of curiosity. The kind that happens when two worlds meet and neither one knows exactly what to do with the other. Tom's heart pounded not from fear now, but from the overwhelming realization that he was still standing. He was still here, in the middle of this sacred, fluid space between man and Mustang. The foal, exhausted and trembling, had now slumped against its mother completely, its eyes half closed, head lowered in surrender to both fatigue and the comfort of being home. The mare's breath moved in slow gusts through her nostrils, and though she watched Tom with quiet attention, she made no move to drive him off. In fact, she had begun to lower her head slightly, licking at the foal's damp shoulder with long, slow strokes of her tongue, a gesture of reassurance, of claiming, of comfort that only a mother could offer. But she did it without shielding the foal from him, without positioning herself between them. That subtle choice said more than words ever could. The stallion remained unmoving, still flanking them both. But the tension in his muscles had eased. His body, once coiled like a bow ready to snap, had settled into a more relaxed posture. He stood tall, but not rigid, alert, but not bristling. The decision he had made earlier, to step aside, to let Tom kneel with the foal, was not being reversed. And that meant something. It meant the standoff had reached its tipping point. Now came the harder question: What happens next? Every instinct in Tom's body told him to retreat slowly, to back away and give them the space they clearly deserved. But something deeper urged him to wait, not out of pride, not out of stubbornness, but because the herd hadn't moved. They hadn't closed the circle, nor had they dissolved it. They were still choosing, still weighing, and walking away too soon could shatter the fragile trust that had begun to take root in the wet earth beneath them. From the edge of the formation, a young colt stepped forward. Gangly, no older than a year, his legs were still too long for his body, and his movements had the awkward confidence of youth. He trotted up to the foal and sniffed it quickly, then turned his attention to Tom. For a brief, breathtaking second, the colt reached out and touched his damp muzzle to the man's knee. It wasn't a full nuzzle, more of a curious tap, but it sent a ripple through the entire herd. A few of the mares twitched and shifted. The stallion's ears flicked, but no one called the colt back. Tom didn't move, didn't react, let it happen. And in that small act of stillness, another truth became clear. They were testing him, not through aggression, not through intimidation, but through proximity, through silence, through giving him just enough rope to either hang himself with fear or prove himself with stillness. In the wild, stillness is trust. In the wild, movement speaks. And by doing nothing, Tom was saying everything. More horses began to step forward now, a few at a time, closing the distance not with threat, but with investigation. They circled slowly, some cutting near the foal, others veering closer to Tom himself. A grey mare with a torn ear sniffed at his boot. A stocky gelding circled behind him and paused there, just a breath away from his back. He could feel their warmth surrounding him now, a cocoon of muscle and wild breath and weathered grace. Their smell was sharp and earthy, wet hide, crushed grass, the tang of adrenaline and rain-soaked soil. And still, the stallion held steady. He watched the movements, the interactions, and allowed them to unfold. He didn't challenge Tom. He didn't step between him and the rest of the herd, because whatever this was, this strange, unspoken negotiation of presence, it was being allowed. It was being observed. The foal, though still weak, lifted its head again and nickered softly. The sound was small, almost a whisper, but it was enough. One of the younger mares leaned down and nosed it gently, followed by another. Each gesture was a check, a greeting, a return to normalcy. The herd, once a tense ring of protectors, was transforming minute by minute into something else, something that almost resembled family, or at least a momentary one. And then came the most unexpected shift of all. The stallion, without warning, walked directly past Tom, not aggressively, not with dominance, but with absolute confidence. He didn't look at the man as he passed, just gave a soft snort and moved toward the edge of the circle. As he did, the other horses slowly followed suit. Not away, not abandoning, just repositioning. The pressure of the standoff was breaking. The shape of the herd was relaxing. The ring was turning back into a herd. And Tom? He was no longer at the center. He was just part of the landscape now. A human who had done something that mattered and then had stayed long enough not to undo it. He exhaled deeply, for the first time realizing just how tightly he had been holding his breath. The foal nuzzled into its mother again, and the mare responded with another low nicker, softer now, more rhythmic. The sound of peace, of return, of balance restored, and Tom stood there, soaked to the bone, knees muddy, heart still trembling, not because he was afraid, but because he had never felt anything like this. He had stared into the face of the wild, not from behind a lens or a page, but from within it, and the wild had stared back and let him stay. Something had changed, not just in the herd, but in the air itself. The tension that had hung over the clearing like a drawn bowstring was loosening. The herd moved now with fluid, unhurried grace, as if the threat had passed, as if Tom had been weighed and measured and found not to be a danger, but something else entirely. Not one of them. No, that would never truly happen. But for this moment, this rare and impossible moment, He had been allowed inside the invisible circle that separates the wild from the rest of the world. It wasn't a matter of being accepted, it was something older, more mysterious. He had been recognized. The stallion, who had stood as the unflinching guardian of the herd since the very beginning, now stood at the periphery, his body no longer coiled, but relaxed. He watched everything, yes, but without the fierce scrutiny from before. His eyes had softened, his stance slightly shifted, no longer positioned to intercept or confront. Instead, he had taken a post that felt almost ceremonial, as if guarding something that had already been deemed sacred. The mares grazed in slow, distracted rhythms, their heads lowering to tear mouthfuls of wet grass, ears still rotating toward every sound, but no longer fixed on Tom. A few of the yearlings ambled nearby, one even daring to sidle up within arm's length before darting away again with a startled toss of its head. But what Tom noticed most was the foal. The little creature had found its feet, though shakily, and now leaned into its mother's side, nuzzling her belly in search of milk. The mare shifted, obliging instinctively, and the foal latched on, feeding with desperate hunger. That single act, the return to nursing, to life, hit Tom harder than anything else, because it wasn't just about survival anymore, it was restoration. It was a moment of peace, reclaiming ground after violence, nature stitching itself back together, cell by cell, heartbeat by heartbeat. And Tom knew, without anyone needing to say it, that if he had been a second too late, none of this would be happening. That gulch would have swallowed the foal, and the herd would be grazing somewhere else, carrying a silent absence in its formation, a hole where a life had been lost and nothing would ever fully fill it. And now that hole didn't exist. The foal's presence here, its tiny wobbling legs, its insistent suckling, its soft bleats of contentment, was proof. And Tom had brought that proof back. Not for himself, not for glory or thanks, but because he had heard a cry and couldn't ignore it. The simplest act of all, to help because it was right. Suddenly, the mare turned her head, slowly, deliberately, her dark eyes locked onto Tom. For a long moment she simply looked at him, unblinking. There was no fear in her gaze, no anger, but there was depth. Something ancient and alive behind her eyes, something not quite human, and yet somehow intimately familiar. It wasn't gratitude in the way people knew it. It was closer to understanding, a kind of non-verbal acknowledgement that said, "You intervened, you returned what was lost, and for that we see you." Tom lowered his gaze slightly, not in submission, but in reverence. Not because he felt small, but because he understood how large this moment was. The layers of it, the improbability, how many things had to align for it to exist. The storm, his presence, the herd's return, the decision not to run, but to trust. It was all impossibly fragile, and yet here it was, holding together as if it had always been meant to happen. Then came the sound that would stay with him forever. A low, soft whicker, not from the mare or the foal, but from the stallion. It was not a warning or a command. It was gentle, measured, directed not toward the herd, but toward Tom. He turned slowly, locking eyes once more with the great horse. The stallion's ears flicked forward, then relaxed. His head dipped a few inches, a simple gesture but powerful in its restraint. A nod, not of surrender, but of respect. An offering, brief and rare, from a creature who had no reason to offer anything. Tom didn't move, didn't break the moment. He just stood, knees still muddy, clothes heavy with water and river silt, and accepted it, not as a triumph, not as a reward, but as a kind of truth. In that low-pitched whicker, in that nod of the stallion's massive head, something wordless had passed between them. Not peace, not friendship, but permission. And permission, in the world of wild things, was more precious than anything else. Around him, the herd resumed their lives. Slowly, they began to shift, some moving toward the edge of the trees, others drifting lazily through the tall grass. The foal, now fed and steadier on its legs, trotted clumsily a few paces before returning to its mother's side. The moment was ending, but not breaking. The tension hadn't returned. It had transformed into something different, a shared silence, a mutual departure, as if everyone present had agreed that something extraordinary had just occurred, and now it was time to leave it behind, as sacred things often are, untouched and unspoken. Tom took one step back, then another. No one followed. No one blocked him. A few of the younger horses looked up, curious, but said nothing. He backed away from the center of the clearing, heart full, mind reeling. And as he walked, he didn't look over his shoulder. He didn't need to. He had carried life out of danger, stood in the center of the untamable, and come through the other side without teeth or hooves turned against him. He had been recognized by the wild, and now it had let him go. Tom's boots pressed softly into the wet grass as he took another step back, still facing the herd, still trying to understand what had just happened. The weight of it hadn't settled yet. It hovered around him, heavy as the clouds still lingering on the horizon. The herd, slowly dispersing across the field, had begun to fall into a rhythm that felt almost normal, grazing, walking, nudging one another in that subtle, languageless way that horses do. But the normalcy was only surface deep. Something invisible but unmistakable still bound them all together, like the final note of a song still vibrating long after the music has stopped. Tom could feel it in the way the wind shifted, in the way the foal turned its head every few minutes to check for him, and most of all, in the presence of the mare who had never stopped watching. She had not followed the rest of the herd. While the others spread out, she remained anchored beside the foal, who now stood more confidently, its legs still a little unsure but holding firm. And beside her, unshaken in his sentry-like role, was the black stallion. Tom had thought the interaction was finished. The unspoken agreement had been made, the foal returned, the boundaries respected. But as he turned to begin his retreat in earnest, the stallion lifted his head and stepped forward. It was just one step and then another, but with each one, the space between them shrank again. Tom stopped walking. He didn't dare raise his hands, didn't speak, didn't shift his stance. He simply watched, every sense stretched thin and open. The stallion was moving slowly, not with caution, but with intention, not as if preparing to challenge, but as if measuring distance. Every hoof landed with quiet finality, deliberate and steady, until the great animal stood just a few feet away. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Tom's breath slowed, not out of calm, but out of awe. The stallion's eyes were deep, unblinking, reflecting not just the image of the man before him, but something far older, the memory of the storm, the cry of the foal, the impossible sight of a human carrying one of their own from the edge of death. What passed between them wasn't language. It wasn't even emotion in the way people understand it. It was a recognition of consequence, of meaning, of gesture. The stallion lowered his head, not in submission, but in clarity, the way only an animal that fears nothing can lower its gaze. He extended his neck slightly, nostrils flaring, then stopped, close enough for Tom to feel the heat of his breath again, close enough to smell the wild musk of rain-dampened fur and prairie dust. The stallion lingered there, studying him, until he let out a short, deep exhale that blew past Tom's cheek and into the space behind him. That was when the mare moved. She too had remained back, unmoving for what felt like hours. But now, with her foal fed, upright, and surrounded by safety, she stepped away from it for the first time, not toward the herd, but toward Tom. Her steps were slow, every joint bending with a deliberate grace that spoke of strength, not fragility. She came to stand at the stallion's side, and for a heartbeat, the three of them formed a triangle: man, stallion, mare, a shape that could not be made again, not in this lifetime, maybe not in any. The mare's eyes flicked toward the foal, then back to Tom, and then, astonishingly, she did something that defied everything Tom knew about animal behavior, especially from wild horses. She leaned forward and touched her forehead to his chest. It wasn't a bump, it wasn't an accidental brush, it was a press, gentle, deliberate, held for a few seconds before she pulled away. And when she did, she let out a low, resonant nicker that vibrated through the air like a voice from the earth itself. It was not a command. It was not a warning. It was something between farewell and blessing. Tom stood motionless, too stunned to react, his heart pounding not in fear now, but in reverence. The stallion remained beside the mare, silent, watchful, but unmoved. What had happened didn't seem strange to him. It seemed right, natural, as if this wasn't an exception to the rules of the wild, but something older than the rules themselves, something buried deep in the roots of survival, the ability to see beyond the familiar and recognize something different, not as danger, but as ally. The foal let out a soft, high whinny, and the mare turned instantly. Her body shifted back toward her young one, maternal instincts snapping her back into her role like a returning tide. The stallion gave a low snort, then backed away with her. Neither of them looked at Tom again. They didn't need to. Their message had been delivered. Tom remained where he stood, too overwhelmed to follow, too respectful to intrude. His pulse still echoed in his ears, each beat reminding him that he had just been part of something unrepeatable, not because it was extraordinary in the eyes of the world, but because it was real, unforced, unscripted, true. These were wild animals, and he was just a man. And yet, for a sliver of time, their worlds had not just brushed. They had intersected, shared space, meaning, even trust. As the herd began to move again, the rhythm of hooves faded across the field. The mare rejoined her foal, who now trotted more confidently at her side. The stallion took position slightly behind them, ever the sentinel, ever the guardian of his world. Tom watched until the last tail disappeared into the tall grass, the prairie swallowing them in gold and green and silence. Only then did he exhale, and as he turned at last to walk away, back toward the ridge, the memory of that warm forehead pressing into his chest stayed with him. Not as a story to tell, not even as a miracle, but as something quieter, a promise that the wild, when met with courage, compassion, and stillness, sometimes answers back. Tom's steps were slow and uncertain as he began to retreat from the field, but the word retreat didn't feel right anymore. He wasn't fleeing. He wasn't withdrawing from something dangerous. If anything, it felt like he was backing away from a sacred place, like someone tiptoeing out of a cathedral after stumbling into a private prayer. Every inch of distance he put between himself and the herd felt like something being carefully unraveled, not broken, not lost, just set down, returned to where it belonged. The foal was alive, stronger with every moment, and now shadowing its mother's movements like a heartbeat. The herd had shifted again into its natural rhythm, the tension drained, the edges softened. What had once been a wall of instinct and suspicion had become a current, flowing around and past him, no longer needing to test or defend. But one thing was clear, they still watched. The stallion hadn't taken his eyes off Tom completely. He allowed the mares and foals to move ahead, filtering into the distant brush, but he remained at the edge of the clearing like the closing page of a story that wasn't ready to end. His body language didn't suggest threat or even caution anymore. It was more like curiosity, as if some part of him still hadn't entirely resolved the question of who Tom was. Not what he was, a human, but who. The stallion's role wasn't just dominance. He was a guardian of meaning, a keeper of memory, and something about what had happened today was going to stay with him. That Tom understood in his bones. Tom paused once more, instinct guiding him to look back, and that's when it happened. The foal broke into a shaky trot, not away with the others, but back, toward him. Its legs were still unsure, but its steps were deliberate. The mother called out immediately, a short, sharp whinny, but the foal didn't stop. It didn't run far, just enough to close the gap between where Tom stood and the place where the invisible thread still stretched between them. Then it stopped, stared at him, one ear flicking, one front leg raised. That same wide-eyed innocence now laced with something new. Memory. Tom didn't move, afraid any sudden shift would drive it back. But the foal didn't flee. Instead, it took one more step forward and lowered its head briefly, a gesture so small it could have gone unnoticed if Tom hadn't been watching every muscle, every breath. It didn't nuzzle him, it didn't make contact. But that motion, that dip of the head, mirrored something. It mirrored the stallion's earlier nod. It mirrored the mare's silent press into his chest. A third piece of the puzzle had clicked into place, and somehow it felt like this young creature, barely strong enough to stand on its own, was passing on the final message. A thank you, not in human terms, not wrapped in language, but unmistakable nonetheless. The mother whinnied again, this time lower, more insistent, and the foal turned quickly, legs tangling for a moment before it caught its balance and bounded back toward her. The brief break in formation ended just as quickly as it had begun. The foal vanished into the long grass, absorbed again into the herd, and the world fell back into its old rhythm. The rustling of the field, the song of wind through the cottonwoods, the hush of the wild settling into itself once more. Tom stood for a while longer, unsure if he was waiting for something or simply unwilling to let go. His clothes clung to him with the weight of river water and the memory of mud, but he didn't care. Every scrape on his hands, every aching muscle in his back where the foal had rested, felt like part of a debt now paid in full. He turned at last and began the walk back toward the ridge, his legs leaden, his heart light. The sun, filtered through the thinning clouds, painted the horizon in soft oranges and golds, casting long shadows across the plain. He walked in silence, and though the herd was now behind him, he could still feel them. Not in a mystical way, not as if they were watching, but as if something in him had changed, and their presence had been stitched into it. There was no sense of finality, no curtain dropping. It felt more like a chapter closing in a book that hadn't yet revealed all its pages. The kind of ending that leaves you quiet, not because there's nothing more to say, but because anything you say would only take away from what had already been spoken in silence. By the time Tom reached the crest of the ridge, the herd was a blur of motion below, slipping into the tree line, their coats catching the light one last time before vanishing into shadow. Only the stallion remained visible, standing just at the edge of the clearing, framed by the fading sun. He didn't move, he didn't call out. He just stood, watching, until Tom took the final step over the rise and disappeared from sight. What had happened wasn't magic. It wasn't a fantasy. It was something rarer than both. It was real. And that reality would live on, not in stories, not in fame, but in the quiet knowing that, for one heartbeat in time, trust had been built across a boundary that had never been meant to be crossed. A line had been drawn in the earth by instinct, and for reasons beyond explanation, it had been stepped over, not with conquest, but with care. And the wild had allowed it. The trail back to higher ground wound through a narrow corridor of sagebrush and wind-twisted junipers, the kind of place that normally offered only solitude. But Tom didn't feel alone. The ridge that had once marked the boundary between watcher and wild now felt like part of a greater circle, one he had unknowingly stepped into. His mind was still caught in the rhythm of hoofbeats, not as echoes behind him, but as something imprinted deeper, like a pulse he could still feel in the soles of his feet. Each step forward carried the strange weight of something unfinished, like a conversation paused, not concluded. He had begun to believe that the moment was over, that the exchange had ended in the clearing below, but as he reached the midpoint of the trail, something stopped him cold. A sound. It was not loud, it was not urgent, just a low, almost musical nicker that drifted through the air like smoke, impossible to pinpoint, yet undeniable. It came from behind him, from the path he had just left, and it wasn't a call of warning. It was something gentler, like a suggestion, a presence not yet done with him. He turned slowly, and there they were. The stallion had followed. But he was not alone. Behind him, spread out along the narrow trail and spilling back into the open field, the herd had gathered again, not in a tight defensive huddle, but in a pattern unlike anything Tom had ever seen. 2 lines, perfectly spaced, horses arranged not randomly but deliberately, one after another, forming a corridor down the very path Tom had just taken. At the front of the line stood the black stallion on the left and the foal's mother on the right. And between them, in the space where the trail opened like a gate, stood the foal. For a moment, Tom didn't move, couldn't move. His mind scrambled for explanation, for any framework to put this into something he could understand. But nothing in science or behavior studies could account for this. It wasn't instinct, it wasn't randomness, it was choice. And the message in their formation was so clear it hurt. Come. The foal took a few uncertain steps forward, its head high, legs still unsteady but determined. Then it stopped and turned its head, looking back at him, waiting. Tom's breath caught in his chest. He walked forward slowly, cautiously, every movement deliberate. And as he approached the lines of horses, something astonishing happened. They parted, not all at once, not chaotically. One by one, like dominoes tipping, each horse stepped just slightly to the side, maintaining the shape of the corridor, but making room for him to pass. No fear, no flight, just silent, absolute awareness of his presence. The space that opened before him wasn't just a path, it was an invitation, and Tom, overwhelmed by the gesture, stepped into it. The foal came forward again, brushing lightly against his thigh, before falling back into step beside its mother. The stallion nodded once, that same subtle dip of the head, and then turned, leading the procession forward. Tom walked in the middle of them, encased on both sides by warm bodies, powerful legs, watchful eyes, not as a prisoner, not as prey, as something else entirely. The rhythm of hooves surrounded him. Horses shifted with synchronized grace. He could feel their presence like a heartbeat, pulsing beside him, around him, through him. No one rushed. The herd moved with a kind of ceremonial stillness, as if the air had thickened into something sacred. This was not an escape. This was not a return to grazing. This was a procession, a passage, a walk through memory. They moved as one, up the trail, past the ridge, across the upper plateau, where the sun finally broke through the last of the storm clouds. Golden light spilled across their backs, igniting every slick coat with brilliance. Dust rose gently from the earth, stirred by hooves but never frantic, painting the trail in soft clouds that caught the light like mist. Tom didn't know how long the walk lasted. Time had folded in on itself. Minutes stretched into miles of meaning. Every step was a confirmation, every nudge of a flank, every flick of a tail, a gesture of trust, of respect, of something not entirely understood but fully felt. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't thanks in any simple sense. It was something older, quieter, a way of saying, "We saw what you did, and now we're walking you out of our world with honor." When they reached the overlook where his gear still waited, untouched beneath the gnarled branch of a juniper tree, the procession slowed. One by one, the horses peeled away, drifting into the tall grass like shadows reclaiming the earth. The stallion remained at the edge. The mare and foal stood close together, framed by sunlight. And Tom stood alone once more, but not truly alone. He turned back to face them, unsure of what to offer. A bow of his head, a whispered thank you. It didn't matter what he chose. The moment didn't need his words, because the herd had already spoken. With every step they took beside him, with every inch of ground they allowed him to share, they had carved a message into the earth. The wild remembers. The wind at the overlook was different than it had been in the valley below. It didn't howl. It didn't sting. It moved gently, like a sigh released after holding something in for too long. Tom stood in the golden hush of the high plain, surrounded by the quiet echo of hoofbeats still vibrating faintly in the earth beneath him. The herd had stopped behind him, not because they were uncertain, but because the walk had ended. The moment had reached its final breath, and what lingered now was the weight of what they had just shared. He turned slowly to face them, the stallion at the front once again, his shadow long and still against the fading light. The mare stood just behind him, her body curled slightly around the foal, who was now strong enough to stand without trembling. It nuzzled her flank, then looked up at Tom with a gaze so steady it stopped his breath. Not in awe, not in fear, in familiarity, recognition. That look was not from an animal who had been saved and forgotten. It was from one who remembered. Tom took a slow step forward, and the foal responded. It walked toward him again, this time with more certainty, its gait still uneven but purposeful. It didn't cry out. It didn't hesitate. It stopped just a few feet away and stared. The space between them now wasn't just physical. It was something unspoken, the space that opens when two lives that should never have touched do, and nothing can be the same again. The foal blinked, then took a final step closer and gently pressed its nose against Tom's leg. A second passed. Then it turned and walked back to its mother without sound or drama, as if that one gesture had closed the loop, as if everything that needed to be said had already been written in that single brief contact. The stallion moved next. One last time. He crossed the short distance with the weight and purpose of a creature that understood ceremony without needing it explained. He came close enough that Tom could feel the warmth of his breath again, close enough to see the lines of age and dust and storm etched into the planes of his powerful body. The stallion stared at him, not challenging, not questioning, just seeing. And then, for the second time in a single day, he lowered his massive head and brought it forward until his forehead lightly touched Tom's chest. The contact lasted only a moment. But in that moment, everything that had happened, the storm, the river, the foal's scream, the muddy climb, the circle of hooves, the silent acceptance, the walk through wildness and across the invisible line between man and animal, was bound together like a final thread being tied. Not a farewell, not an ending, just a closing of the space between two worlds. The stallion lifted his head, looked once more at Tom with eyes that held something no photograph could ever capture, and then turned away. The mare followed, the foal close behind, and one by one, the rest of the herd began to move. Not in fear, not in haste, in unity, in peace, into the long grass and toward the horizon, where the sun now spilled molten gold across the earth. Their shapes became silhouettes, then shadows, and then, finally, nothing at all. Just the memory of motion, just the rhythm of hooves carried away on wind. Tom stood alone again at the overlook, but the loneliness didn't sting. He didn't feel left behind. He felt full, not the kind of full that comes from answers, but the kind that comes from having witnessed something no explanation can reach. He had entered their world not by force, but by chance, and instead of turning him away, the wild had offered him something it rarely gives: presence, trust, and a moment shared without fear. And as he finally turned back to his pack, slinging it over his shoulder and beginning the slow walk home, he didn't think about what he would tell anyone. He didn't think about trying to prove what had happened, because some things weren't meant to be told. Some things were meant to be carried. He would carry the weight of the foal again, in dreams, in memory, not as a burden, but as a reminder. He would remember the feel of its breath against his neck, the tremble in its legs, the way it had pressed itself into his arms as the river tried to steal them both away. He would remember the silence of the herd as it surrounded him, the low whicker of the stallion, the nod, the press of a wild forehead into his chest, and the walk between the lines, not as an honored guest, not as an intruder, but as something far more rare, a bridge. As he crested the final hill, the sun now dipping below the horizon and spilling fire across the tops of distant trees, a gust of wind moved through the grass behind him. And in it, just faint enough to make him question whether it had ever been real at all, came the soft, fleeting sound of a whinny. Not calling him back, just a sound carried by memory, a sound saying, "You were here, and we will not forget."